In this video, we're going to discuss switch port security, which allows you to specify which devices can connect to a switch port, as well as the maximum number of devices that can connect. We'll also discuss DHCP snooping and ARP inspection. Let's start with port security. As you know, switches maintain a content addressable memory table, or CAM table. A CAM table maintains a record of all the MAC addresses the switch has learned and which interfaces they were discovered on. For example, let's suppose we have 4 connections on this switch, and let's assign a label to each one. When the device connected to the first port is powered on, its MAC address is discovered by the switch on this port. Let's say the MAC address is 2222. This isn't a real MAC address. I've shortened it for the sake of simplicity. At the same time, a MAC address of 3333 has been discovered on this interface. As a result, the CAM table looks like this. The CAM table indicates that a MAC address of 2222 has been discovered and that its host is reachable on interface E1. Likewise, a host with a MAC address of 3333 has been discovered on interface E8. By default, all switch ports will allow any MAC addresses to be used. For example, a host with a MAC address of 4444 may be discovered on port E12. The switch would add that address to the table, indicating that it was discovered on E12. The switch doesn't care which MAC address is learned on a given port. If a device is disconnected and a new device is connected to a particular port, the switch will purge the old entry, add the new entry, and start forwarding frames. For example, if you disconnected the workstation connected to E12 and plugged a different workstation into the same switch port, the existing entry would be removed from the CAM table and the new device's MAC address would be associated with that switch port in the table instead. However, this could present a security issue. You probably don't want just anybody plugging into these switch ports. For example, you don't want someone from the outside of your company to bring in their laptop and plug into a port to gain network access. You want to lock down your switch so that you know which MAC addresses are connected to each switch port. In order to achieve this, you can implement port security. There are 2 basic options to configure when you implement port security. First of all, you can restrict each switch port to a specific MAC address, and you can also set the maximum number of MAC addresses that can be learned by a particular switch interface. Let's look at an example. Suppose I want to restrict these 3 switch ports to just these 3 nodes. I can add those MAC addresses to the switch and then associate each one with a specific switch port. For example, we can say that port E1 is only going to connect to the host with the MAC address 2222. When the other node tries to connect to the interface, it won't be allowed. When you configure port security, you can specify 3 different actions that can happen whenever a violation occurs: protect, restrict, or shut down. The protect action blocks unauthorized hosts from connecting to a particular switch port. It will simply discard any frames that come into the port from an unauthorized host. For example, if we were to restrict port E1 to a host with the MAC address 2222, and then some other device tried to connect to the port, the connection would be denied. The restriction action is very similar. It also discards data from unauthorized hosts. It doesn't allow any unauthorized host to connect. And it also creates a log message that lets you know what happened and where. Shutdown is the most extreme action. If an unauthorized host connects, then its frames are discarded. A log message is sent and the port is taken offline and put into what we call an error-disabled state. As you can see, the protect and restrict actions don't actually disable the port. They just prevent the unauthorized node from functioning on the switch port. The shutdown action, on the other hand, does disable the port. To bring the port back online, you, as the administrator, must manually reactivate it. When these protection actions take place, there's a short listening period while the port determines what to do next. During this time, known as the forward delay, if a switch port is unable to determine the action in the set period, the port will enter a switching loop. If this happens, a spanning tree algorithm can help determine which action to take. A spanning tree protocol, also known as STP, is a network protocol that prevents switch loops and provides fault tolerance. Spanning tree creates one single active path between two network nodes to eliminate switching loops. To further protect your STP topology, you can install a BPDU guard to protect against protocol data unit attacks. BPDU is a data message that contains port information and other data. It's exchanged by the switches that use spanning tree protocol, and BPDU guard can disable the port. Root guard is like BPDU guard, but it allows the device to participate in STP, given that the device doesn't try to become the root. For attacks caused by flooding, flood guards are used. With flooding, the device is overwhelmed with network packets transmitted through an algorithm to all nodes. This can cause a DDoS attack. Flood guards help protect your network against this threat. Flood guards can be individual devices or firewall components, and they monitor the network traffic to detect any DDoS attack in progress. Some switches also support DHCP snooping as a security measure. DHCP snooping filters out untrusted DHCP messages received from outside the network or firewall. In essence, the DHCP snooping acts like a firewall between DHCP clients and your DHCP servers. It maintains a DHCP snooping binding table, which matches MAC addresses with DHCP messages. With DHCP snooping enabled, the switch will drop DHCP messages if the frame from the DHCP server is received from outside the network or firewall. It also drops DHCP messages if the source MAC address and the DHCP client MAC address don't match what's in the DHCP snooping binding table. Some switches also provide the dynamic ARP inspection feature, or DAI. DAI is designed to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks by validating ARP packets in the network. To do this, DAI associates a trust state with each interface on the switch. Packets arriving on trusted interfaces bypass all DAI validation checks, while packets arriving on untrusted interfaces must undergo the DAI validation process. By default, all interfaces are considered untrusted. In a typical network configuration, you would configure all the switch ports that are connected to network computers and servers as untrusted. However, all switch ports connected to other switches are configured as trusted. When DAI is enabled, the switch performs several validation checks on an entrusted port. First, it intercepts ARP requests and responses. Each interceptor requests a verified to ensure that it is a valid IP to MAC address binding. Valid IP to MAC address bindings are stored in the DHCP snooping binding database. If the packet has a valid binding, then the switch forwards the packet onto the appropriate destination. If the packet has an invalid binding, the switch drops the ARP packet. That's it for this lesson. In this lesson, we talked about switch security. We first reviewed port security, which allows you to lock down ports to specific MAC addresses or control the maximum number of hosts that can be learned on a particular switch port. We also talked about the protection actions that can be taken if these policies are violated. We discussed the spanning tree protocol, DHCP snooping, and ARP validation.